Hello and welcome to Queerful. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Benjamin Rose and I'll be your host, so buckle in. Welcome back to Queerful. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Wherever you're doing that, whether that's on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube, in the Anchor app, wherever you're listening, thank you so much for joining me. Queerful is an exploration of the many ways that LGBTQ plus folks of all stripes are creating social change, challenging power structures, inverting binaries, and thriving in a heteropatriarchal world. This week, I am joined by my friend Ameera Khan. Ameera is a Bengali American Muslim whose Islam is informed from a myriad of sources, including theological training in the completion of her hifz, or memorization of the Quran, and both traditional and progressive Muslim perspectives. She is informed by Sunni, Sufi, anti-patriarchal, and liberation theology-oriented traditions within Sharia, Quran, Hadith, and Islamic history. This includes properly interpreting dominant narratives around commonly cited Islamic excuses for homophobia and transphobia, including the story of the people of Lot. She joined the Muslim Youth Leadership Council as a youth activist in 2018 to learn how empowered queer and transgender Muslims are reclaiming their narrative across the country. She has held numerous workshops surrounding the topic of reclaiming queer Islamic history, broadening the narratives of who is considered a Muslim or a vessel of divinity and wisdom. She has also organized conferences, most recently the Muslim Youth Leadership Council's first virtual conference on May 2nd and 3rd, 2020, which drew virtual attendees from across the globe. In her professional life, she typically works as a DevOps engineer. I first met Ameera because we were both involved with some faith-based nonprofit work, some student organizations at UW-Madison in Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I call home. Though our experiences and our backgrounds are different, I definitely felt a connection when we first met because we both share sort of a very fervent childhood and a deep sort of religious nerdiness. Ameera is someone who has earned the title of Hafiza, which means that she has completed the memorization of the Quran, which is quite a feat. I have not done anything to that level, but I can definitely respect it and relate to it as someone whose adolescence was deeply defined by my religious context that I was raised in, and Bible quizzing was my world for many years, where memorizing pieces of scripture was how I spent my free time. And so in this conversation, you're going to hear us talk a lot about sort of religious scriptures, religious experiences, and reconciling that with being a proud out queer person. And I think that those narratives are really important because a lot of folks resonate with that. That tells the story of a lot of queer folks, is sort of trying to reconcile an upbringing or a background that wasn't always the most queer friendly with your identity and who you are now. So this is a topic and a conversation that I'm really passionate about, as you can probably tell, and so I hope that you will glean something from it as well. So let's jump in and listen in on this conversation. All right, hello, Ameera. Thank you for joining me in one of these early episodes of Queerful. I'm excited to chat about religion stuff and queer stuff and nerdy stuff. How are you doing?
Yeah, my soul feels light and content. Um, Everything is new and fresh for me in this new. I've just gone through like some transitions in like where I live, as I just moved to a new city where I only knew like 5 people, and now like I'm meeting so many lovely people who I am like falling in love with way too quickly, and I got a new job, and the job has been really great, and my team has been phenomenal, and I don't know, it's a lot of transition, and it's a lot of um tricky things mixed in with like fruit.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a weird time to be making transitions, but it's good to hear that they've been good, because I could imagine that making transitions in the midst of like a pandemic and like an uprising would be stressful, but I'm glad that there are good
Mhm.
things too. So yeah, let's jump in. They already heard the introduction and heard a little bit about you. I want to start off just talking about like your identity as a queer person. That's a lot of what I kind of want to explore with this podcast, is how queerness manifests in so many different ways, in as many different ways as there are people. So what was it like for you, in as much detail as you do or don't want to get into, sort of like coming out and coming into yourself as a queer person?
All right, Bismillah. Well, I'm gonna start off by saying Bismillah in the name of God, and with a prayer by given to us by Prophet Moses, which is قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي, which translates to, O my Lord, my nourisher, grant for me confidence, and expand my chest, and loosen the knot on my tongue so that people may understand me, essentially. And that is a prayer that is given to us in the Quran that Prophet Moses read, before he spoke with Pharaoh. Not to make any analogies there, but um, yeah. So, what what's the question regarding my queerness again, just so I can get that out of the way?
Yeah, just kind
Mhm.
of like an introduction to how did you come into your queerness, and what does
Yeah.
queerness mean for you?
So, I first, I was raised very, very conservative Sunni Muslim in St. Louis, and so there was no room or space in my theology and understanding at the time for queer spiritual people to exist, really. So I kind of was in this limbo of like getting hints that I was queer, but pushing them away because that wasn't something that computed in my world. And then, uh, and then what happened is I fell head over heels in love with a boy at the time. We were both boys at the time. Now we're both girls, apparently.
Love that. I love that.
Right. But I fell in love with this person and I was like, wow, like why am I so taken with them? Why do I want to like spend all of my time in like fake doing a science fair project so that I have an excuse to go hang out with him? Um, and so I was spending so much of my time with Dave, and then after a while they were like, Amir, you're gay. And I was like, no, I'm not, right? They're like, yes, you are. Like, do you look at yourself? Like, what, like, where are you spending all of your time? And I was like, no, I'm not. And then I went home and I was like, it was gnawing at me. And I was like, is that really me? Right. And then after a couple of days of thinking about it and like sleeping on it, because sometimes I just like, it's the Sagittarius in me wants to kick all my problems down the road and not address them immediately.
That's for future me.
So I went to sleep and I woke up and it was still gnawing at me and I was like, I think Dave's right. So that's when I realized that I was gay, but then it came with like this sadness, this deep sadness because I was like, I can't, that means I can't be holy or beloved in the eyes of God or my community, right? And um working on that since like, and so that is when I first discovered my gayness, and then after that I worked hard to like reconcile that, but it was like sort of a like low level, well, what's the word, it's, you know, like that brain meme where it's like barely glowing and then glows a
Yeah.
little bit more and then it glows a little bit more. So like the next stage was I can be gay, I just can't act upon it, right?
Yep.
We love the sin and hate the sinner.
Yeah.
Um, or the other way around. We hate the sin, we love the sinner. But it was really hard to love yourself if like that's part of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I then went to college with this secret sort of in my heart, and in college I was exposed to the Black Lives Matter protests, right? Because this was after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, which was 20 minutes north of our campus. And
Wow.
so many of the protests came onto the campus and students joined, and I didn't know what all of this was about. I was oblivious. And I was like, well, if he just listened to the cops, then he wouldn't have been shot. And so this was a moment of transformation for me because I, despite not agreeing with these protesters, I decided to challenge myself and listen to what they were saying and really try to put myself in their shoes. And that is how I unlearned all of these sort of like systemic racist like white supremacist stories that have been embedded in all of us because of the society that we live in and are brought up in. So when I was in this period of unraveling all of these things I've been taught about race, I also decided to do an experiment in unraveling the narratives that I was taught about gender and patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So my experiment was that I was going to dress as a woman to understand how it is to feel to be a victim of patriarchy. So then, for the last couple months of the year, maybe like 3, 4 months, I was dressing femme on campus and going to classes and facing the ridicule that came with that being like a mask presenting person.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of like my way of like challenging myself to be like how can I understand where the patriarchy is coming from so that I know where to address it. But then what happened with this experiment is that it just hit too far, too on the nose, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, this feels too natural for me. And I kept wearing femme clothes. And then the new year came around and I said, screw it. I'm going to make a leap of faith and um, ask my coworkers to use she, her pronouns for me as my New Year's resolution. Probably the only New Year's resolution I've ever kept. Um, and I started using she, hers on January 1st, 2017, and I've never stopped since then because it felt right. So that experiment in understanding and having empathy for victims of patriarchy essentially um made me realize my identity as a trans woman. And of course, not to say that men are not victims of patriarchy as well, because indeed they are, because of the gender roles that they are expected to uphold, right? Which are not serving of the broad vastness of masculinity as well. Um, that said, that's sort of the story of how I fell into my queerness, first coming out, not being a one-time thing, but coming out in stages, first as gay and to myself, and then coming out to other people as gay, which was, long story short, I basically did a spoken word piece at a all Muslim conference in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I came out of the closet on the stage in front of hundreds of Muslims, and it was very scary and very liberating. But that was coming out as gay, and then later on I came out as trans, and so it's like this iteration of coming out until I've come to where I am today.
Yeah, that is. I love that. It's like these transitions, like you said, the brain meme where you're like you're at little brain and then just like leveling up.
Yeah.
I relate to especially what you said about like I love that story about dressing more femme or like presenting more femme to like
Mhm.
sort of understand that experience, and then you're like, oh wait, like this feels normal.
Yeah.
And like I had similar experiences sort of in my journey, like first coming out as like a gay man and then coming out as like a non-binary person, where I would start like painting my nails and stuff and you know, which cis men can absolutely do as well. And like that's why I think it's so important that like gender roles, we should expand our vision of what gender and gender roles can be, because
Mm-hmm.
like the more we can free people, even if they think they're cis or are cis, like to experiment with that, like who knows what you could discover about yourself. So I,
Yeah.
yeah, I love that. It's kind of like a, that experimentation, feeling free enough to do that can kind of lead you to be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh wow, this is actually like a truth about myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. One thing I wanted to keeping with that like brain meme idea, like so going from that, you mentioned like that love the sinner, hate the sin sort of rhetoric, which
Mm-hmm.
happens a lot. So
Mm-hmm.
what kind of led you from that to sort of the next level then of being like, wait, no, I am holy, like I am like loved and lovable, um,
Mm-hmm.
but I am still very queer. Like what kind of led you to
Yeah.
that next level?
Yeah. So, I think my one word answer to that is community.
Hmm.
Because community is so interesting, right? When you're looking at sort of your faith, your religion from like a strictly sort of like textual or like legal standpoint, right? And you see like as a Muslim, I saw, that okay, here's the people of Lot. Their sins were being homosexual, right? Is what it was taught to us. Therefore, being homosexual is bad, um, like in the eyes of God, right? But I was also like, well, the prophet, there's also all of this emphasis of the prophet being like nice and like turning the other cheek from women who came up to him saying, "Oh prophet, I have adultered, like I have had a child out of wedlock. Like the legal punishment for me is to be stoned." And he would turn his way and his face away and act as if he had never heard her. And he did this continuously, right? So as to allow her to be spared from that punishment and to raise the child, um, so that the child can be self-sufficient and all of these things, right? So there's all of these, like that's one example. Another example is every single time that you begin reading the Quran or you begin doing anything, you're instructed to begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. So there's all of these really uplifting aspects of theology that are so emphasized, and so I'm like trying to balance these out as a kid. I'm like, okay, well, if being homosexual is bad, but being merciful and assuming the best of other people is good, then why are we making assumptions that people are gay based on how they talk or based on how they dress or care about their appearance?
Mm-hmm.
And why is that assumption itself incriminating
Hmm.
of that person, right? And so there's this gap between what is like textual consensus and what is social consensus. And that gap is sort of what is really expanded upon when you think of like pedophilia in the Catholic Church, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the injunction that Mormons have to not be like politically engaged for Mormonism, but you see them pushing for uh gay marriage illegality and stuff like that. So you see this like huge clash between what the religion teaches you and how it is practiced.
Right.
And so that clash it's kind of like it's arbitrarily decided. It's decided by sort of the behaviors and the cultural beliefs of those people, and it's not based in the religion. Now, all of this aside, that's why, I mean, all of this in mind, not aside, all of this as a background. Um, Now I have discovered a community, right? So I went up on the stage, I read my spoken word poetry, and the pushback was that some people came up to me after that poem and were like, That was so powerful. That was so brave of you. Thank you so much for talking about this because Muslims don't talk about gay Muslims ever, and it needs to be talked about. And some people who are like organizers officially apologized on Facebook for allowing me to perform my spoken word piece. Um, I still won third place just to flex, but um, but after that, after the awards ceremony, actually, I was approached by one girl who was like, "Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I know we're here in freaking Kentucky and we don't know each other, and we're gonna leave and forget about each other after this. However, I do have a friend in New York. She's also Bengali, just like you, and she's really queer inclusive. Can I connect you with her?" And I said, of course, like I don't have anything against that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to find a community who is inclusive of me and like believes I'm a human being, I
Right.
guess, and has
Yeah.
the same cultural and religious background. So then I was connected to Shahana Hanif, who, if you know that name, she is actually the first Bengali woman to be running for the city councilwoman in Brooklyn, Queens, New York. And so I was connected with her long before her campaign, which is currently happening, right? It's currently in full swing. Unless the campaign is finished by now, I need to check on what those results were or are going to be. Um, so I was connected with her, and she, in turn, connected me with a group on Facebook, tongue in cheek, called Radical Muslims. There's a picture of a Saudi guy in full like Saudi garb on a skateboard, and the background's like a rainbow flag, so like radical Muslims, right? Um, and it was very there was lots of other queer Muslims in that group, and that was the first time I ever had any representation at all of queer Muslims existing. Um,
Yeah.
that were not me. For
Yeah.
so long, I was like, I thought I was the only one. And now I see a bunch of them, many of who are really also struggling with their faith the same way as I am, and many of who have gone past that hump and are very secure in their own sense of identities. And I admired that, despite also being hesitant to move to that because I'm like, well, I need to know the theology that allows me to be there as
Right.
well, and I don't think I have that. And there is where I was connected with like actual theological resources such as Scott Kugel's Homosexuality in Islam, among other resources. And so ingesting those resources changed my understanding of my religion enough that I was like, I think I get it, but I'm still scarred by the emotions. I'm
Mm-hmm.
still scared to make that leap of faith again, right? And so then I was connected with Al Tawheed a circle of which I am a active participant of today, right? And they are a queer inclusive masjid that is based out of Toronto but has many satellite mosques across the United States, Canada, and other parts of the world. And there I was connected with Imam El Farouk Kaki, who is one of maybe less than 10 openly gay imams in the world, and he leads this congregation out of Toronto. Um, and his theology, his sermons, and also the community of people who he has built, who also have a very like liberatory theological perspectives. With this community, I was able to feel at home and undo that social consensus that I had always seen.
Mm.
So even though I had undone the theological consensus in my mind, I was still scared to undo the social consensus until I had found a community that supported my theology. And so that is where I have
Yeah.
found and now and has allowed me to really flourish in my understanding of myself and my security and my identity and what really guides me every step of the way I take.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That is like, community is such an important piece of like discovering
Mm,
theology. And that's like, I was thinking about when you were talking about that gap between like social consensus and textual consensus,
Mhm.
I think a lot of times like folks have a tendency to misrepresent that gap as being non-existent or too small, because like when you're sort of caught up in thinking that your context is the only context, then you're like you
Mhm.
don't see the difference between those two things. um yeah, that yeah, that's really helpful. Finding like you can you can read all of the books and you can like do all of the study and you can come to this like
Mhm.
intellectual position where you're like, I know that I'm not an abomination. But if like you don't have the people around you that are like, you're not crazy, like you're, you know, to
Yeah.
sort of encourage you to realize that that context is not the only context,
Yeah.
then you can finally start to like internalize it. And yeah, I think that's like that, you know, that's I guess like the hidden danger of the whole
Mhm.
love the sinner hate the sin thing, is it's kind
Right.
of like collapsing those like social consensus and textual consensus together, and
Mhm.
which does real damage. So yeah,
Mhm.
thank you for sharing those resources too that you found. That's helpful. um yeah, wow, there's like so many different threads in that that I'm like, yes, this is so beautiful. Community is how we develop our theology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing that you mentioned in your bio that I was just like eyebrow raised, I was like, this is super interesting, was talking about like reclaiming queer Islamic history. I
Mm.
love that phrase, and especially like thinking about how history, at least in Midwestern US, like is very much told from like a dominant Eurocentric lens,
Mhm.
which ends up being, you know, Eurocentric and also very cis het and like all these other things.
Mhm.
So I'm just wondering if you could like expand on that, and like what does queer Islamic history mean to folks who might be thinking like, what is that?
Yeah. So this is talking about when I think of when I think of history in general, right? When you're taught history in a public school, right? There's the running joke in the queer community, right? That it's like, oh, these anthropologists discovered these two men who like lived together and ate together and slept together and
Yeah.
spent their whole life together. They were just really good friends.
Just gal
And
pals.
right, right. Instead of like making the obvious connection that they're
Right.
breaking the heteronormative lens that you're imposing on every sort of society that has ever existed.
Right.
And so that that heteronormative lens of white supremacy
Mm-hmm.
is actually documented of being imported into colonized nations via colonization,
Hmm.
right? So you have, for example, indigenous folks of North America identifying and like existing with five different genders, right? And when white people basically came to the United States and held them and their people at gunpoint saying if you don't conform to these two genders, you're going to be thrown in jail or your kid is going to be hit in school because they stand out,
Right.
or and like all of the systemic ways of destroying like that their gender as well as their entire culture, right? By forcing them to speak English and convert to Christianity and all of these things. That's how you systemically, like remove a people from themselves. And so that has been done via colonization to the entire Muslim world, right? The which Yeah, which is why many like Muslims today, many colonized peoples today will be like very insistent on like it is a man and a woman and there is no third gender and there's, no marriages outside of that. It's because generations ago they were told if you don't believe this, we will kill you or
Mm-hmm.
we will rob you of your resources or whatever it was, right? And so that is an inherited trauma, to be completely honest,
Yeah.
right? And so you're raised with this fear, this just overwhelming fear of, if you don't fit within those roles that the white man has created, then you're going to be eradicated, right? And that is a big aspect of historical erasure. So now that we've talked about that, within the Muslim um world, essentially, there has been plenty and plenty of documentation of queer figures, right? During the time of the Prophet, everyone always says in the Sunni Muslim world to look back to the time of the Prophet and his noble companions, right? Because they're the ones who set the precedent for the religion of Islam as it is today. Well, most people don't know that there was a transgender companion of the Prophet,
Hmm.
right? Her name was Hayth radiallahu anha, and she was a mukhannath, which is the term that was used at the time to determine someone who was assigned male at birth and then later was living as a female. Now, whether that is because they were intersex and biologically they couldn't have children or something, or
Right.
whether that is because of like them realizing their identity, right? Those are distinctions that we, with a Western lens, make, and may or may not have been relevant at the time of the Prophet.
Right.
Nonetheless, this person existed outside of the gender binary and was allowed to exist in the company of the Prophet as such. So this is like it's very well documented. It's not like a weak hadith or anything like some people like to say. If anything doesn't agree with their viewpoint, they're like, oh, it's made up. That hadith isn't a real hadith. Well, it's Bukhari and Muslim. No one ever argues with Bukhari and Muslim anyway. Um, so that's one example, right? Right in the time of the Prophet, in his presence. There are plenty of other examples outside of that. When you think of like Bulle Shah, right, who is a very, very well-known, prominent poet of the Indian subcontinent, who is known for writing lots of poems about like the devotion and the love of God and the universe and other people. And um in his Sufi training, he actually had a master who was teaching him the Sufi ways, a teacher, and he learned one day that his teacher was a fan of belly dancing. So Bulle Shah went to a prostitute, essentially a sex worker, and learned the art of belly dancing, and then to the point that he performed this belly dancing in a club where when his teacher arrived and didn't recognize him. And so he did this belly dancing for his teacher and then revealed himself afterwards. Now, if that's not queer, I don't know what is.
Right. Yeah, I don't know how people can take like stories like that and be like, well, and just like go into this long like thing about defending how like it's not, like you said, like the historian
Mhm.
approach where like gonna impose this lens. It's
Mhm.
like they're just gal pals, like they're just like there's nothing,
Yeah.
look away, there's nothing queer here.
Mhm.
When it's
Mhm.
in the text.
Yeah. So this just it's just moments like that and their significance in shedding light on how we can exist today without being outside of the fold of any of what we've been taught.
Mm,
That's systemically erased, um, because the victors write the stories
right.
that determine history, right? And the victors have typically been white supremacists, unfortunately. And so
Hmm.
that's how the systemic erasure happens.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's I've been like getting into more like history reading as part of my quarantine hobby. And it's just like every time I just get so frustrated about how like, modern lenses are sort of like eisegeted into like the texts in like in religion and also in like American history, and it's just like it happens over and over and people are so adamant that it's like, well, we're just reading the text. You know, like we're just reading the text. It's like, yeah, you're reading the text with like your current contextual lens, you know, as we all do. But like, yeah, it's so frustrating because there's so much queerness throughout history. Yeah.
And just as a side point, because it's on my mind and I've been talking about it with a couple of people, is this idea of a Western lens that elevates the written word of history, the written form, right? And so if something is written, then only then is it considered a actual like legitimate piece of history, when so much of history, especially the queer parts of history, are not written down. They sort of exist orally or interpersonally, and they're not like government documents, which oftentimes were the only documents that were deemed important enough to write down, right? So even just the elevation of like the written history erases so much oral history, which Arab culture and indigenous American culture have plethoras of that.
Yeah.
In particular.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Like just elevating if it's not written down, then it's or even like things that I've been reading about Magnus Hirschfeld, like a queer Jewish man who like had this entire library of research about like gender and like intersex folks, and like had been doing research for his whole career, and like it all got burned down because it was, you know, not allowed, and it was censored, and so all of this history and research got burned. And so like who knows what was in that library that like now today people will say like, you know, all these different gender expressions are such a new like Tumblr thing when really it's like all this history has either been passed down like orally and like in communities, or the stuff that was written was like systemically destroyed. So it's like, you know, you can't win.
And even you can talk about like, just, you don't even have to go back centuries, just like queer brown and trans ballroom culture in the Bronx, right? That was not like documented until Paris is Burning, and even then that was documented in a very white supremacist way without like the consent of the people who were interviewed or paying them or any of that, right? So it's like they don't exist as part of the historical narrative. They exist as tidbits, as sort of aberrations in the narrative of what history actually is, right? Quote unquote, actually.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I like, it's so wild to me, just to see like there's that, I don't even remember what it's called, like the new show that's about like ballroom culture. It's like a competition show now.
Is it Pose?
No, not Pose.
Okay.
I don't know why I can't think of it. It's gonna come to me. I'm sure once I'm listening to this later, it'll be like obvious. But yeah, it's like I haven't seen it yet, but it's about ballroom culture, but it's like a competition show, and I know there was a lot of like discourse on Twitter about who like the judges were and stuff, and I'm not in it enough to know all of that. But it is interesting that like people are comparing it to Paris is Burning, as if Paris is Burning is like the first time that ballroom culture existed. When really it's like that's just the first time that someone sort of completely outside of that culture, like they were not part of the culture, came in with a camera and told the story through their lens. And so it's like
camera being almost an evolved form, a camera being an evolved form of the written word that is considered, you know, like history today, right?
Right. It's like, well, now it's like we can believe that this is valid, or like we can believe that this
documented.
Exists.
Yeah.
And it's like just because it's not within your context doesn't mean it doesn't exist, which is just another way that like white supremacy is like tries to isolate and convince. It's like, well, we're the only thing that exists, like that's, you know, don't look beyond. Thank you for sharing that. One last question that I kind of wanted to get into, something more personal. I know we've talked before a little bit about like different queer history stuff, working with like interfaith campus stuff. And I know that you like are very educated, like you know like a lot about the text, you know a lot about history and all this. But like you said, like people will sort of jump to these defenses of like, oh, you're reading it wrong, or like, oh, that's not like the
Mm-hmm.
point of the story. So I'm wondering, like,
Yeah.
to the extent that you want to share, like, what is your experience with people maybe like assuming it's like, oh, well, you just haven't read the text, which is like such a wild, the wrong
Mm.
assumption, or just people
Mhm.
sort of like jumping to, well, if you studied more, you would come to my conclusion. Is that something that you've
Mm.
like encountered?
Yeah, definitely. I encounter it all the time, and it's so antithetical to like the point of what religion brings into each of our lives, right? Um, um, yeah, when people say I haven't read the text, I'm like, clearly I have. I've memorized the entire text.
Exactly.
Um, And then they're like, oh, well, then you're reading it out of context. And I was like, I've read Tafsir bin Kathir. I know context. I know hadiths that are surrounded asbab and nuzul, right? The conditions of revelation
Mm-hmm.
that surround the revelation of these verses, right? I'm not claiming to know every single one of it, but I know enough to justify my existence.
Yeah, right.
Um, which is, of course, the burden of justifying your existence is always pushed on the marginalized
Mm.
um, community, oftentimes, right? You don't have to justify your existence if you're a white male.
Right.
Um, uh, that said, many people uh, will just never be satisfied and continue moving the goalposts of being valid enough or being good enough of a debater to actually be, okay in their eyes or valid, right?
Right.
And the fact is that that's just dehumanizing. That is making you overly justify your existence in a way that, first of all, you shouldn't. Second of all, is again is antithetical to what all religions teach us, right?
Yeah.
Which is a step and a guidance and the pursuit of being fully human.
Mm.
And so dehumanization goes against that directly. Um, there's obviously guidance, there's obviously context that can be provided, that can be taught by those who have the knowledge and those who have the authority. But even then, it is important to critique that and to be like, are all of the scholars here straight men? Are all of them looking from a conservative or majority, opinion, or a Sunni opinion instead of a Shia opinion? Or all of these, or like there's so many contexts and like
Right.
uh lenses, group lenses almost, that people uh sort of erase or brush over in that sense. And at the end of the day, I believe, right, the Quran and Islam and most religions, they have texts for a reason. They want you to read it.
Mm-hmm.
The point of the text is so that you can read it for yourself. You can learn the context. You can learn the stories. You can learn the analogies and parables and take away something that will benefit you and your community. And so how that happens, how that message is twisted into ways um that are abusive, right, happens with this sort of kangaroo court view of looking at it, right?
Right.
And it is up to all of us to challenge what we've been taught in those kangaroo courts, right? And to always expand on, is there a piece of context that is missing here that is liberatory and provides us a step on the path of being fully human. So yeah, haters gonna hate is basically the summary of this. Um, it is a lesson that I learned very young, being a brown, poor, low income family in a very rich public school. It was public, so not everyone was rich, but I went to school projects with all of my AP classmates who lived in gigantic 3-story houses,
Right.
and who ended up at Ivy Leagues. And yeah, I can do the whole Sagittarius American dream. I worked my way there, bootstraps, yada yada yada. But all of this said, that's not a tangent I want to go on. Um, and yeah, I don't know where the original point I was trying to make here was, but haters gonna hate. Oh, that's where it was. I was surrounded by people who didn't think I could succeed, and I surrounded myself with those who did believe in me. And when they stopped believing in me when I came out as trans, right? Because the people who believed in me were mostly the Muslim community. Then
Right.
when they stopped believing in me, I found more people, other people who also did believe in me. So, and again, that comes back to the importance of community.
Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna end this this question with an analogy that that is given to be by one of my models, my role models, in St. Louis. His name is Sayer Johnson. He is the co-founder of MTUG, the Metro Trans Umbrella Group,
Hmm.
a nonprofit that is founded by and for trans people and seeks to provide them with resources, um, including housing and food and access to like gender affirming care and clothes and all of these. So Sayer Johnson is a trans man. He's very proud of it. He has 2 lovely children. When one of them came out to him and said, "Dad, I think I'm trans," he said, "Well, son, find your people." That's the first thing that he said. And I think that finding your people is so, so important to being human,
Hmm.
to allowing yourself to thrive instead of holding yourself back.
Yeah,
At the end of the
absolutely.
day, we are all we have.
Right. Yeah, you can spend your whole life like trying to like change the minds of people who hop into your DMs and demand explanations for things, and like there are days that you may or may not have the spoons to do that, but um like yeah, like at the end of the day, being human is not about justifying your existence, just to live another day. And yeah, that's a beautiful note to to lead with, is just like find your people. And that's, I feel like in almost every story that I hear about like queer folks, regardless of the story or the context that they come from, it always, the turning point in the story always happens somehow with like, and then I met queer friends, like or then I had a mentor, even if it's just like that one family member who accepted me, whatever the case may be. It always starts with
Mhm.
like finding someone, and that's always the
Yeah.
turning point, because it's like
Mm.
at the end of the day, it's not about history or intellectualizing. It's about like building community, and that's how we take care of us.
Mhm.
Is there any final thoughts that you want to leave as we wrap up?
I guess I'll, if anything, one thing that my ancestors have been telling me this quarantine is they've been telling me to focus on healing through movement. So if
Mm.
you're looking at this and you're cooped up in the house because of COVID, go and move your body. Move.
Yes.
And that's how you heal. And if you're cooped up at home and you don't know how to support Black Lives Matter, because there are still people on the streets marching for Black Lives Matter, join the movement somehow as well, digitally, right?
Yeah.
So, movement in all senses of that word.
Yes. Move. That is so needed in a time when so many of us have been felt feeling stuck in so many
Hmm.
ways. So yeah, thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. It is always a pleasure. I always learn something new. So thank you for joining me, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Queerful. I loved having this conversation. Really, this entire podcast is just a pet project of mine because I get to have conversations with people that I think are cool about topics that I find interesting. And the fact that other folks want to listen in on that is just sort of an added bonus. So I am really grateful for your listenership. I would also love to get your feedback if there's things that you're really loving, if there's things that you want to hear more of, please let me know. And on that note, you can connect with me online as Mix Benjamin Rose. So that's MX Benjamin Rose. So you can find my website at mixbenjaminrose.com. And that's also my handle for all of the social media platforms. So feel free to reach out to me. I would love to connect with you and become internet friends. If you want to hear more from Ameera, you can also connect with her on Facebook and Instagram as @BengalBrony. That's Bengal Brony. You can also find her on LinkedIn as Ameera Khan if you want to connect in that way. If any of the conversation that you just heard piqued your interest and you want to learn more, I do have a resources page on my website. If you go to mixbenjaminrose.com/podcast, there you can find episode notes for all of the episodes I release of Queerful. And for this episode, I'm going to share all of the links and resources that Ameera shared, and probably some others as well. So if you are interested and want to learn more about what we talked about, you can go to mixbenjaminrose.com/podcast and find more information. If you did enjoy this podcast, it would mean the world if you liked, subscribed, rated, reviewed, whatever is applicable on the platform that you're listening on. That would really help more folks find these conversations. I appreciate you, and I will be back in another 2 weeks for another episode of Queerful. Until then, love you, bye!